Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Today we've got Liverpool Black Men's Group, and we're going to be doing a podcast. I'm joined by two fellow members, Ray Corliss and Lawrence Westcap, and going to be doing a podcast talking about the continuous presence of black people in Liverpool over at least 300 years. So, just to get things rolling straight away, I'll let the guests just give themselves a brief introduction if they want. But I'm Patrick Games, I'm one of the members of Black History, Liverpool Black Men's Group, and I'm a writer, poet, community activist, journalist now as well. So, I could go on, but I'll hand over to Ray or Lawrence to give themselves a brief introduction. We'll start with Ray.
My name's Ray Corliss. I've been a community activist for over 40 years now. I'm also a member of the Black Men's Group and also involved in a company called the Heritage Development Company Liverpool, which identifies community assets, historical community assets of Liverpool's black community and elevates them through the medium of exhibitions.
My name's Lawrence Westcap. I'm also a member of the Liverpool Black Men's Group. I'm a historian and community activist. I've been involved in a lot of different projects over the years. I'm currently working with National Museums Liverpool as their historian in residence.
Okay, so we're just going to jump right into the conversation. Liverpool, as many people may not know, has a long history of black presence stemming back into the early 1700s and probably before that, but from what is definitely known. And one of the prime examples, I will hand over to Lawrence to say more because he's an expert on this particular subject, is the black presence, not just that's in Liverpool, but that as a lot of it's come out of Liverpool's links with the slave trade and slave economy. And there was a ceremony that was held last year to honour one of the oldest documented black people at the moment. So, Lawrence, I'm just going to ask you if you can tell us a bit more about the person described as Abel, who belonged to a Mr. Rock, if I'm correct, who was buried in 1717.
Yeah,
in St. Nicholas Church. Yeah,
well, you've kind of just described him, really. So we know very little about him apart from the entry in the actual burial register for him. So Abel is mentioned in the parish records of St. Nicholas's when he was buried on October the 1st, 1717. And as I say, he was referred to as Abel, a blackmore belonging to Mr. Rock. Mr. Rock probably being Mr. Samuel Rock, who was a very prominent Liverpool slave trader in the early years of the 18th century. And from his burial there in October 1717, there's been a documented continuous presence of black people in the city's archives, written archives, primary resources that show clearly that there's this continuous population of black people in the city, and that goes from the early 18th century right up until the present day.
Okay, well, what I find most fascinating about this, because I know I haven't had the pleasure to not only work with Lawrence on the Liverpool Black History Research Group, but attend some of his slavery history tours, is that Liverpool population in general at the beginning of basically the 1700s amounted to a couple of thousand people. And I've heard Lawrence say, in that sense, well, what would a quintessential Scouser look like, given that you've got this black presence in Liverpool for what is clearly over 300 years, with a population of maybe less than 4,000 at the time, the turn of the 1700s. So it's interesting to surmise how many of them was part of the black population, but clearly they were residents of Liverpool, and what became Liverpool, and have been ever since, a continuous presence which has always grew. So it's just an interesting scenario when people say, I've grown up being told many a times to get back where I come from, or being asked the question, where am I from? Which usually I reply, down the road, where are you from? you know, which
Can I
gets like some
interject there?
raised eyebrows, but yeah.
I mean, I think that's one of the most fascinating things about being British. You know, like the idea that black people have not contributed to the development of this country over the long durée since Britain has had empire is just ridiculous. You know, black people who are in Jamaica, I use this when I speak to, I take a lot of young people around from London who are first generation born in. I always say to them, listen, don't let anyone ever tell you that you don't belong here, because whether or not your ancestors were here or whether you're in the Caribbean, their toil and slog was to build this country, not their own country. The reason why so many countries that were former British colonies are so underdeveloped is it was all about wealth extraction. You know, black people in the Caribbean and in West Africa particularly toiled for this country to build this country, not to build their own countries. So you can't tell me that black people are scroungers who've come here. You know, we've contributed as much as any group of people, and probably in some cases more so than others, but because of our skin colour, people kind of try and other us. You know, I always say to people, well, my family been here for 200 years, Ray's family similarly. You know, we fought in every war this country has fought, I can say about my own family, since the Crimea. Yet someone whose name might be Schumacher, whose dad may well have bombed this city during the Second World War, he can come here and as long as he has a Scouse accent, he's considered to be more Scouse than I am. You know, when my family have fought and died for this country for, like I say, well over 100 years, that's the insanity of race, isn't it?
Yeah, because that filtered through after the Second World War, when you had the Windrush Generation coming here from 1947 onwards, and they'd obviously been party to and part of the British Empire for several hundred years, 200 years at that time. And then what happened was Windrush gets questioned. Issues of immigration legislation are brought to the fore on the one hand. On the other hand, they go to Europe with the European Volunteer Force, including members of the Wehrmacht, who were prisoners of war, members of the SS who were prisoners of war, collaborators with the Nazis from a variety of different countries throughout Europe, who were then led into this country with full civil rights, passports, housing, education. They were brought into this country, not through the back door, but through the front door, and yet who had supported the empire for 200 years were being questioned. Their validity of status was being questioned, being brought into this company, to this country. And that, you know, for me was how things sort of filtered in terms of the discrimination and how the disadvantage is obviously there in your face. My great-granddad arrived in this country from Jamaica in 1868 and married my great-grandmother, who was white, Alice, and she was from Bilston in Wolverhampton. And, you know, as part and parcel of the same process, they faced discrimination and disadvantage all along the way. And still to this day, that resonates still to this day with families who've got 10 generations in this city, easily. And so the contribution that has always consistently and continually been made by black people, whether it's through the colonies, through the dominions, through the territories or whatever, is constantly questioned, and it's always questioned by white people. And that is where I always draw the line, because you've got to draw the line, because it's white colonialism which always draws upon these issues, and it's white colonialism today in many aspects. You only have to see and listen to the attitude of the Asian Home Secretary in this country today, whose family, by the way, were kicked out of Uganda by Idi Amin, and she has the cheek to basically contest how people arrive in this country these days. So that's how I see the whole 300 years in this city, in terms of how it's impacted upon people and people's families and generations.
In light of that, I think it's also really important to kind of highlight how black people have contributed to the development city over that 300 years. You know, a lot of people don't realise just how much we've contributed, both in very notable and highly visible ways, but also in those less notable and, you know, more mundane, everyday type of varieties, and that's something that I think it's really incumbent upon us all to kind of highlight, particularly for our own young people who do grow up without necessarily a sense of belonging in a time when race is again becoming such a volatile issue. But we don't, I really struggle with this idea that, in Liverpool we don't have any black history educational clubs for our young people. You're more likely to see black men particularly set up a football club than set up an after school educational club for our own young people. It seems to me that things that are around like performance, music seem to have much more of or seem to be much more valued by our own community than equipping our young people with the skills necessary to survive life in white society. And that's something that I really struggle with, and I often wonder, well, why, when other groups are more in tune with the importance of providing educational opportunities, which at the end of the day provide transferable skills, which broaden your horizons, give you far more opportunity, and yet we tend to focus on things that narrow your opportunities. I love playing sports myself, I enjoy music, but the focus that we tend to put on those seems to me to be heavily overemphasized in a society where you now need a serious high quality education in order to get any type of decent paying job.
That's it. And just to add to that, obviously, it's all well and good having these sports and musical activities, but they can be great vehicles to recruit people to then widen that knowledge and then use that as a vehicle to educate them on other matters. And it shouldn't just be the only focus, and that's the only focus alone, because in reality, who's going to be that number one on Spotify? Who's going to be that number one in the top 40? Who's going to be that the next Liverpool or Everton star or Manchester United star when it comes to football? You're talking very few, next to none. You know what I mean? When the amount of people who were involved, and that's for all youngsters, but especially for although there is a rise in black footballers in the sport, again, to equip them with knowledge and experience to tackle the everyday isms of life and racism. As we've heard and we're going to keep hearing, racism's never gone away. It's just being brought more back to the forefront. A lot of people who have hid behind certain things and being a lot closed with their racism and now feeling empowered to be more open with it due to things what Ray said about the Home Secretary, the Prime Minister and different people in government. Who's given them that newfound voice. It's coming a bit of a cliche, but it's got to still be repeated. We see what happened in the Euros with the footballers getting that abuse after missing penalty shootouts, and how quick as well we seen the media jump on criticising Hungary for booing Raheem Sterling the other day. You know what I mean? But when it comes to the English fans who were doing it, that's kind of been brushed under the carpet quickly. But just going back to this continued presence in Liverpool and all the contributions that black people have made and continue to make, there's one or two characters, and there's one person in particular I want to ask Lawrence a bit more about, because I know it's some interesting background information. A guy who, because we mentioned music, the name just popped back into my head, and when you hear the name, you think of who? James Brown, isn't he, that American guy who sings? But this is a different James Brown who originated from Liverpool, and without me watering down the impacts and the knowledge of what James Brown contributed, I'll hand over to Lawrence to give you a bit more in-depth insight into who James Brown was, and not James Brown, the soul singer.
Yeah. Well, James Brown, the guy you're talking about, the Scouser, he was born in Liverpool in 1815, thought to be the grandson of a man who served with Nelson on the Victory. He went to the Blue Coat. He was educated there. He was apprenticed to become a printer. Printer was in Price Street, which is just off Cleveland Square. And he then went on to work for a number of different newspapers in Liverpool before going over to the Isle of Man and setting up his own newspaper, the Isle of Man Times, as well as being a newspaper magnate, I suppose you'd say, and certainly in the Isle of Man. He was also someone who was very involved in what I would say is activism. He was very influenced by the Chartists. He wrote a number of different pamphlets highlighting and complaining about the fact that the House of Keys, the House of Government on the Isle of Man, was not a democratically elected body. This led to the members of the House of Keys throwing him in jail. And giving him a 6-month sentence for sedition or something crazy like that. And it created such a furore on the island that they had to release him, pay him compensation. And within less than 2 years of this event taking place, the House of Keys had become a democratically elected body. It's a black Scouser from Liverpool who is seen as the father of democracy in the Isle of Man. You know, and his brother stayed in Liverpool, was very involved in the temperance movement. John Gough Brown was a real figure in Liverpool society. When he retired, he was given a golden Albert chain. He was involved in we're talking about music. He was involved in a lot of the choral societies. He was just another one of like the real notable black figures in Liverpool during the Victorian period. But again, our kids don't know about this. You know, our kids don't know that the black presence in Liverpool throughout the entire 300 years has always been socially stratified. It's not always been a case that we were always on the lowest rung of the social economic ladder. The black presence in Liverpool mirrored the white presence in that you had people who were very poor, but also people who were fabulously wealthy. And that again is another side, you know, another side of the story of the black community that most people aren't aware of. And I think it's incumbent upon us to kind of highlight these stories and change the dominant discourse, you know, about black people always being, you know.
But this is the reason why, isn't it, why people set up the sports club, the football club, because they don't have this provenance of history. It's not delivered to us in the same manner as British history, with inverted commas, is delivered to us and poured down our throats on a daily basis if you're at school and being educated. But what you don't find is we don't gain access to this sort of historical information. It's just not there. It's not out there. It's not delivered through the education system. It's not delivered through schools. It's not delivered in any way, shape or form. We have to go to find it. But we don't have to just find it. We have to establish a mine and then go digging in that mine to find out where all this information lay within that mine. And that's what we have to do. That's what we do constantly. That's what we're doing today. That's what we do through the Black Men's Group. And that's what we do in terms of trying to transmit what it is in terms of their history that is such of a value to every black person, not just in this city but throughout the country. And I think it's really important that it is down to people like us to get that message out there, but to get that message out in a way which is easy to understand and doesn't put people in a complicated situation or scenario, and they can gain access to it through by linking in with people like ourselves. But it is a really, I think it's a really crucial issue about how we transmit and how we disseminate the whole history of our history to black people, because white society doesn't do it, and it does not do it, because when black people respond from an historical perspective, the barriers in white society go up, and its defence mechanisms when black people come up with anything which is innovative, is taking the initiative and being positive. It's always seen from the other side of the equation as being in the negative. I mean, you know, we take the George Floyd issues from last year, and you take Black Lives Matter, and you take Black Lives Matter on the march. Whilst they're on the march, they're being criticised and condemned for responding to issues which has been a continuous issue, not since last year, but for hundreds of years. So it's no different to black people when they see that sort of scenario, but white people don't see it in the same perspective, and that also applies to the links in history as well.
Yeah. I mean, again, sorry to interject. I think it is really about us taking control of our own history. Mm-hmm. We seem to be the only people who don't value our own history in comparison to others, you know, and I worry about that. You know, why is it that I'm more shocked to meet a black doctor than a black Premiership footballer? You know, that is bizarre. Do you know what I mean? For me, it's far more exceptional for me to see a black person who's gone through the academic route in order to find success than it is to someone who's gone through the lottery of sport. You know, that's wrong. You know, there's far more opportunities for the everyday man and woman in the street in terms of education and academia, widening your horizons with, you know, transferable skills than there is for singing and dancing and you know, music, and sports. But it seems, for whatever reasons, we tend to focus on these very narrow avenues of success, where, yeah, if you do make it, you become fabulously wealthy. But for everyone that makes it, there's 1,000, 2,000, 10,000, 20,000 who didn't cut the mustard, you know. And, you know, on the other hand, if you go off and, you know, get A levels and, you know, get these different degrees, regardless if you go down one particular avenue, there's all these other ones that are open to you because they're very transferable skills. And yeah, for whatever reason, as opposed to every other minority group, we tend to follow these very narrow avenues of success. And to bring it back to history, that's why I think history provides a really excellent opportunity for us to kind of look at people who've done it in the past through these less exceptional routes. Do you know what I'm saying? But have been able to become successful and build community off the back of that. I would say there's more, you know, based on my own research, I would say that within our own community, the geographic community that we think of as the black community, there are probably more black homeowners 100 years ago than there is now.
Yeah, probably.
Far more black people are having to live in social housing now in our community. And let's be honest, whatever you think about the idea of owning property, in this country, at least 70% of all the people who live in this country own the house in which they live. Look at that for black people. Look at that for black people in this city. And I'm telling you might be looking as low as single digits. I would not be shocked if someone told me less than 10% of the black people in this city own their own homes. Yeah. That's a real reflection of wealth within the household. Inherited wealth. You know, the most important investment people make is usually in the house in which they purchase. Yeah. But most people I know from our community don't own the house in which they live.
50 years ago, it was different.
It was different.
Yeah. Different 50 years ago because people owned the properties, people owned the nightclubs, people owned whatever they owned, people owned office blocks.
Exactly.
Do you know what I mean?
And they did for self.
Yeah, and that doesn't apply anymore. And you got to ask the question why that doesn't apply. It's not. I don't think it's just a question. I think it's a cultural thing as well, from the perspective of not allowing black people to own anything, which gives them responsibility, gives them authority, and ultimately gives them a power base within themselves. Because when you had 40 nightclubs in Liverpool 8, that's 40 entrepreneurs. That's 40 times, you know, how many jobs in terms of whether you were cleaning the place, whether you were managing the place, whether you were singing in the place, whether you were security in the place. There was social cohesion, there was jobs, there was an economy within Liverpool 8, and that was what was generating the forces of ownership, you know. And then you get to a point where, you know, the compulsory purchase order systems come into play, and then when people have purchased a property for whatever it was worth, they're receiving less money in relation to the value of the market on the day. And so they're being undercut right, you know, that from the outset there, straight away. And then you lose that ownership, the position of ownership, because you've got no money to go on to purchase the next one because you've been paid less than what you paid for it in the first instance. I mean, so you're in negative equity straight away, notwithstanding then, you know, the advent of Thatcherism. I'm all right, Jack. You know, it's all about the individual rather than the collective. And that also took away, I think, some sort of will away from the black community at that time as well.
Do you think so? I actually think that the reaction to Thatcher was the opposite. I think a lot of our most important activism actually comes out of a response to Thatcher and her terrible policies. Do you know,
but in terms of the ownership issue of property, that was where it sort of was reduced.
Well, what I would say is I think that in many ways ownership then kind of, you know, because of our move towards a more socialist, well, we've always been socialist on our outlook, but a move towards a more socialist outlook. But everyone was talking about socially owned houses, and they obviously have their place, but we become an anomaly within this country when you have a country which is so cutthroat capitalist. Like I said, more than 70% of everyone lives in this country owns their own home. The way we measure affluence in this country is usually by the value of the house in which we live, you know. And so this move, almost like it was almost a religious thing as well. It's like, no, we don't want houses for sale, we want houses for social rent, doesn't allow you to kind of progress.
No.
You know, because you're paying rent for the rest of your life. You haven't got a capital asset that you can use to leverage on in order to invest in a business, let's say. And that was something that our great grandparents never had, because we grew up before the welfare state.
Yep.
My nan, the compulsory purchase issues of the 1960s, she lost 10 houses.
Yep.
She went from being a landlady to living in to dying in a council house. You know, your family also owned houses going back to the beginning of the 20th century, if not before. And this is the tradition that our community comes from. But as you're saying, because we don't research our own history, a lot of people don't know those stories, and then two, the impact of the compulsory purchase orders and this move to us all living on in socially rented estates, etc. We kind of lost that tradition.
Yeah,
whereas other people still were able to.
My granddad bought his property at number 14 Kent Street, and I think it was it was either late 19th century or early 20th. It was around 1903, 4, 5, something like that. Something like that, because he got married in 1898 and he moved into Kent Street, I think within the first 5 or 6 years. But he bought it. Yeah. He bought it. And then when he moved from there to Nile Street, and I think he moved to Nile Street in 1938, he bought Nile Street. You know,
he did.
So you know, there's that capacity to move on.
Even when my family history in Liverpool doesn't go back as far as that, but my parents came to Liverpool in 1961. But when they first came, because of the that was in the height of the no blacks, no dogs, no Irish type of signpost. But fortunately, because of that black ownership that still existed at the beginning of the 60s, they were able to get accommodation within black-owned properties, and not just them. Many families came over here, and then they were able to rent like that for maybe a year or two. And because of hard work, you know, they would put themselves in a position quite early to be able to then purchase their own properties, which they did. You know, the house I grew up with and have my fondest memories with as a child was owned by our parents until compulsory purchase came, obliterated it all, and, you know, we ended up in a council house, like lives with many people. A lot of the black community affected many parts of the community, but a lot of the black community in particular, because that concentration of black people within, and when I say within Liverpool 8, within a certain part of Liverpool 8, that's where the greatest number of compulsory purchases took place. And then a lot of people were given false promises that, when we build back even these council houses and so forth, social housing, that they could move back into the area. That promise didn't unfold, and they were dispersed to diverse parts of the city where they faced extreme levels of racism. You know, and if you knock down 50 houses in a street and build back 18, then clearly everybody can't move back there. You know what I mean? It goes without saying, and that had a knock-on effect where it would have a knock-on effect with local shops that were owned by, you know, Granby Street in particular I talk about, because, you know, I can remember coming home from school in the 70s as a child. You literally had to dodge. It was like walking down, if you see an image of Oxford Street now on the news, it was like walking down Oxford Street. It was absolutely packed to the rafters, and you had to, like, you know, pick your way and weave your way through crowded pavements. There was that many people there because there were so many shops of every description in the area, simply again through two reasons. One is black people had a better economic base, and another reason was that town was unwelcoming for us, so we had to have a lot of services from shops and clubs within our own area, and they've all since disappeared, which was, as you said, after the back of what Ray was saying, after the back of these compulsory purchases, Thatcherism came in, and then, you know, obviously the black community felt a massive brunt of it, but the Liverpool community as a whole felt it all with this managed decline because of Liverpool's historic opposition over the last maybe 50 years or so to Tory rule, because, you know, if we go back further, there's a substantial Tory base in Liverpool, which a lot of people would be quite surprised of, and, you know, especially during the slavery area period, you know, the majority of MPs would be of that Tory persuasion and supported slavery to the hilt, and you know, opposed abolition and so forth. As you know, we do know there was many statesmen within Liverpool who championed abolition, but they were clearly outnumbered at many times by the ones who opposed it. So,
I mean, I think it's really interesting as well to kind of highlight the fact that now we've moved to this like cool independent shops, you know, only shop with independents. That's what our community was. Okay, you had the Tesco at one stage on Granby, but on the whole, all those shops were independent.
Yeah.
And people, if you wanted to eat certain types of food, or if you wanted to have certain types of ingredients, you had to come into our community in order to do that.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So if you're talking about that idea of independence and being like a bit edgy and having something a bit different, we've been doing that for literally over a century. Do you know what I mean? And that again is something that is part of our history, and it's part of our historical and cultural DNA that a lot of our young people just aren't really aware of. You know, the fact that, you know, we talk about, you know, independence, the Baltic, for example. The Baltic, before it was the Baltic, before it was even Chinatown, that area was known as Little Africa. Yeah, going right back into the 19th century at least. You know, some of the first people to live in the houses in what is now the Baltic, in places like Kitchen Street, Bridgewater Street, all those streets off Jamaica Street, ironically, were people from the black community. You know, and this is all part of the story that isn't told. It isn't part of the council's narrative. You know, when they talk about you know, we all know about the Irish, we all know about the Chinese, even the Italians in the North End. But this black presence, it's kind of like just people will mention it and then they'll move on. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. When in my family, for example, in the 1871 census, we were already letting houses. We're letting houses. We've got Irish people living in the houses, Greek people living in the houses. So those signs that we talk about, no blacks, no dogs, no Irish, because they were up, we were providing facilities to those people who couldn't get facilities off other white folks. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? And I think that that's really, again, part of the narrative that it's incumbent upon us to kind of highlight and propagate, you know.
So, and all walks, all members of society benefit from this knowledge and history, because obviously, you know, black people, of course, are going to benefit of it because it gives them a sense of belonging, a sense of ownership in that respect. But also, it helps to break down them negative stereotypes as well that exist out there. That black people are this, they're that, they're lazy, they don't want to work, they don't want to contribute, which is, couldn't be anything further from the truth. You know, there's lazy people in society, but that goes across all cultural backgrounds. You know what I mean? But to lay that claim to one particular type of people is a nonsense. But people need to learn this knowledge to be able to appreciate each other more. You know, and break down these barriers of these stereotypes of. And this false impression of superiority, you know, you use like Ray said before, as soon as we bring up certain narratives like this, barriers go up and we'll be accused of, it's almost like it's racism in reverse. And you think, well, what is that? That doesn't even make no sense. By talking about history, which history is factual information about the past, that's what history is, factual information about the past, and spreading that knowledge, to be then accused of racism, when racism actually hides that factual information about the past, distorts it or misrepresents it. So, you know, it's about redressing that balance. You know, everyone can't be taught every single thing, but there has to be a balance. And for there to be a balance, if you're just simply taught, oh, well, black people, black Africa in particular, had no history, it was a dark continent, there was no writing, there was no astrology, there was no mathematics, none of all these things, then you're going to grow up feeling, well, rightfully, that we are better than them. And black people, if they're not aware of this rich history that they have, are going to grow up thinking, well, maybe we are inferior. So these false narratives need to be addressed. You know, so it's a question of doing that, and the best system for that is through the education system. And you know, we will do, but we shouldn't have to be putting on after school clubs, but we will do.
Why are we still having to sort of like tell our story 300 years later, you know? And why are we still having to put it out there that we do have a presence, we did have a presence, and we have been here that long, whether you believe it or not, and we're still just having to say that in some sort of justifiable way, without even recognising, you know, from their own perspective. I'm talking about Liverpool's own perspective, you know, not just with the presence, but how much it tends to hide away from its role within the, you know, the trade of enslaved Africans across the Atlantic, in terms of how much this city is built upon it. We're talking about 300 years, and I don't know how long ago it was when they were naming Ale Road, Huskisson Street, Blundell Sands, names of different streets all over this city 150, 200 years ago. Well, that demonstrates quite clearly, for me anyway, how long the presence has been here. If you continue to recognise the role that those individuals played within the slave trade, to the point that 200 years ago you could name a street after them. You know, so that to me sort of, you know, brings out even further, you know, how long we've been here and puts a stamp on it. Yeah. But yet we still have to sort of sit here and defend the position that we have in terms of who we are and what we're about and what our provenance is, and that it has to be us to get the history out there. And I totally agree with that it has to be us, because what history has been put out there over the last whatever number of years has been wrong. Yeah. And so it is down to us and groups like ours who's got to disseminate that message beyond the black men's group, beyond the black community, and ensure that it filters into white society, because it's they who have to. It's those people who need to understand as well. Because I think it's really important, because, you know, I'll speak to white people all the time, but they don't have a clue about Liverpool and its black history. They don't have a clue. And these are Scousers.
That's right. See, you know? There's another reason as well why black people need to be the ones who record their own history, because to me, especially in relation to the slave trade, it's like white people benefited from the trade in itself, and now they're benefiting from recording the history of that trade. I see lots, you know, I'm involved a lot with in the academic circles, and I see lots of people making their career off doing research into slavery and the slave trade who are white and don't ever bring anything to the black community as a way of highlighting, you know, the important role that their research has played in giving them the illustrious academic career that they've got. You know, you'll see lots of projects that are being done, and the professor running it is a white man, and all the postgrads who are working on it are white. You know, and if there is any undergrads, they in many cases are white as well.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? So again, there's got to be a way working in collaboration with academic institutions who in themselves, in many cases, owe their origins to wealth accrued through slavery, to kind of use these opportunities as a way of making reparation. You know. And that to me is quite shocking, you know, is that, you know, you've got all these, Glasgow apart, you know, Glasgow's the only one who've held their hands up and say, yeah, we benefited from the tune of £20 million. So, you know, for wealth from slavery, so we're going to pay reparations. And I think, again, if organisations, not just academic organisations, financial institutions, civic and cultural institutions, if they're not going to do it voluntarily, then it's up to us as black men and other activists from the diverse communities to kind of challenge that and say, no, we're not having that. You're gonna have to come to the table and negotiate. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and just in conclusion, because we're just going to finish up now. Just in conclusion, yeah, everything what we've heard today, especially them last closing remarks from Ray and Lawrence, is, you know, hit the nail on the head, especially with regard to institutions and organisations. You know, we have in Liverpool an International Slavery Museum which commemorates the barbaric history and nature of slavery, but yet still you won't find black faces actually working within the building when if people visit there. And I could imagine a lot of tourists maybe, you know, may not vocalise that, but may find that quite remarkable and go away whispering amongst themselves. You know, it seems a bit strange as a museum about slavery, but there's actually no black people working in there, albeit Liverpool's got this old population which, you know, by visiting the museum they will become knowledgeable on that if they didn't have that before. But just in conclusion, the closing sentence, basically, we've talked about that oldest presence, Mr. Abel, the Blackamoor, as he described, from 1717. The fact that that's a record of his burial shows he existed before that. So, you know, even though we're just using the 1717 as a benchmark, clearly that history goes back before that. How long before is yet to be revealed, and hopefully some documentation will come out to rubber stamp that. But the knowledge is clearly there that black presence goes back way beyond 300 years continuously in Liverpool. But thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed it. We could talk on and on this subject all day, all night, but, you know, we have to come to an end at some point. So from the Liverpool Black Men's Group, you'll hear more from us on various other topics, taking in a lot of things. And for everybody out there, black, white, whatever your cultural background, I hope you take note of a lot of the information and try to further your own knowledge on that in many different ways. So thank you again for your time, and thanks to Ray, thanks to Lawrence, and thanks for Chase and Condo Online for having us. So yeah, it's been a good day. Thank you.